Being too good can be a fatal mistake. Dostoevsky shows us this mercilessly in The Idiot, where purity is not celebrated, it is crushed. Mishkin, a man of absolute kindness, does not find recognition, but contempt. He does not lie, does not manipulate, does not play the game, and for that he becomes a problem. The world prefers the cunning over the righteous, the cynical over the sincere. He is not naive. He sees the world as it is, but refuses to corrupt himself. And that choice comes with a price. If being pure means being destroyed, then who is truly in the wrong? The Idiot is not just a drama about a man, it is a brutal mirror of society. If the truth is uncomfortable, perhaps it's because it reveals what we spend our lives trying to ignore. Dostoevsky never wrote to comfort. On the contrary, his words are sharp blades that cut open wounds many would rather leave untouched. He did not want to give the reader a false sense of security, but to make them feel the weight of existence, the moral dilemmas, the decay of the human soul. In The Idiot, he does not deliver a fairy tale, but an unsettling portrait of society. While most writers seek to provide answers, Dostoevsky preferred to lay bare difficult questions. That is why his books do not age. They force us to look within, without mercy, without shortcuts. Mishkin, the protagonist of The Idiot, is not a character to be admired naively but studied as a phenomenon. He embodies purity in a world that despises it, functioning as a literary experiment. What happens when someone completely good is thrown into a cynical society driven by self-interest? Dostoevsky answers without romanticism, without cheap hope. His writing does not promise happy endings. It exposes, without anesthesia, the fate of those who dare to be authentic. For those used to reading merely for entertainment, stepping into Dostoevsky's universe is a harsh wake-up call. The impact of his words is comparable to that of a surgeon who, instead of hiding the infection, cuts through the flesh to expose the full extent of the disease. There are no concessions, no comfort, and that is precisely why he remains so relevant. In an age of superficiality and disposable motivational quotes, Dostoevsky teaches us something fundamental. True growth only happens when we face pain without running from it. Anyone who reads The Idiot expecting a conventional hero or a comforting moral lesson will encounter something far greater, an autopsy of the human condition. This leads us to an unsettling question. If society rejects purity, then what does it truly value? If truth is so disturbing, does that mean cunning and hypocrisy are the real standards for survival? And if so, what place is left for those who, like Mishkin, insist on acting with kindness? This is the trap Dostoevsky sets for the reader. He does not provide answers, only locks us inside this moral labyrinth from which no one emerges unscathed. The world was not made for people like Mishkin. He is a romantic in an era of pragmatism, an idealist surrounded by strategists. While the other characters in The Idiot carefully calculate every word and move, he acts on impulse, guided by a kindness no one understands. To many, he is nothing more than a fool, incapable of perceiving the invisible rules that govern society. But is that really the case? Or does his relentless honesty disturb precisely because it exposes the hypocrisy of those around him? The irony is that despite his gentleness, he becomes a problem. People do not know what to do with someone who does not lie, who does not manipulate, who does not take advantage of others' weaknesses. To them, this purity is not endearing. It is dangerous. Mishkin disrupts the balance of the social game because he refuses to play it. He acts as if trust, love, and forgiveness are still possible, and for that, he is seen as an anomaly. His presence creates an uncomfortable contrast. Next to him, others feel exposed, forced to confront what they have lost over time. But if he is the odd one out, does that mean the others are right? Does the world punish those who act with integrity? Or is the true madness in accepting this punishment as natural? Dostoevsky does not give us a clear answer, but forces us to face the question, is Mishkin naive or lucid, weak or unbreakable? Does the world have a point in rejecting him, or is he the one who truly sees reality as it is? The greatest irony is that by calling his protagonist the idiot, Dostoevsky compels us to consider who truly deserves that title. The novel challenges us to decide where we stand, because at its core, this story is not just about Mishkin. It is about anyone who has ever wondered whether it is worth being truthful in a world that rewards deception. If society ridicules purity, then perhaps the issue is not just about one man, but about a larger system. How exactly does the world react when someone refuses to conform? The label of idiot placed on Mishkin is more a reflection of society than of his own actions. He is called that because he does not lie, does not deceive, does not manipulate. But if these are the criteria for being considered naive, what does that say about the world around him? Has cleverness become a prerequisite for being taken seriously, and anyone who lacks it automatically becomes a target of contempt? Does this mean intelligence and honesty cannot coexist? Or has society simply created a system where being truthful is a luxury few can afford? And here lies the central dilemma. Is Mishkin, who refuses to take part in a corrupt game, a fool? Or are the real fools those who accept the rules without questioning them? Many take pride in knowing how the world works, but does living by these rules make them wiser or just more conformist? At its core, Dostoevsky forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. What holds more value, integrity or adaptation? This rejection of purity doesn't happen only in fiction. In real life, how often are good people treated as fools simply because they refuse to act with cynicism? In the workplace, in relationships, in politics, those who refuse to engage in manipulation are often cast aside. This leads us to an inevitable reflection. Is kindness a mistake? Or is it an act of resistance? But if Mishkin disturbs people so much, it's because his existence exposes something society would rather ignore. When someone refuses to give in, they don't just challenge the system, they force others to look at themselves. And perhaps that's why society reacts by ridiculing, marginalizing, and pushing them away. Because purity doesn't just stand out, it reveals. And this brings us to a bigger question. How does society deal with those who don't fit in? If honesty is a mistake, then what is the correct model of behavior? Society likes to see itself as fair, but its true nature is revealed in the way it treats those who refuse to follow its invisible rules. Mishkin is not just different, he is a disturbance. His kindness and sincerity are an affront to a world accustomed to cynicism. And what do we do with something that makes us uncomfortable? First, we try to fix it. Then, we ridicule it. And if that doesn't work, we eliminate it. The problem was never him. It was what he made people feel about themselves. That's why Mishkin is not just rejected. He is seen as a threat, because by merely existing, he forces others to face their own contradictions. How can one justify small lies and manipulative games when there is someone who refuses to do the same? How can one defend the idea that the world is a ruthless place, where only the shrewd survive when there is living proof to the contrary? For many, he must be discredited, not because he is wrong, but because his presence makes it impossible to move forward without questioning everything. And this mechanism is not exclusive to the idiot. In everyday life, how often is someone who acts with kindness treated as naive? How often is sincerity seen as weakness? And how many people have realized that showing vulnerability quickly turns them into targets? The problem was never purity itself. It was what it revealed about the world. Mishkin cannot win, because if he were right, everything else would be wrong. And admitting that, is unacceptable for those who have already resigned themselves to the idea that life is just a game of masks. But if the fate of those who refuse to play is isolation, what is the alternative? Is it better to give in to cynicism or to stay true to oneself, even at a cost? And this is where we turn our eyes to the historical context. The Idiot did not emerge in a vacuum. Dostoevsky wrote for a society in crisis, caught between tradition and modernity, faith and nihilism, order and revolution. Dostoevsky's Russia was in turmoil, oscillating between a decaying aristocracy and the winds of revolution. The nobility, which had once ruled unchallenged, was seeing its power weaken, while new ideals gained strength. At the same time, Orthodox faith, which had been the backbone of Russian identity for centuries, was beginning to lose ground to skepticism and nihilism. It was a time of transition, where no one knew exactly what the future would hold. And it is in this uncertain landscape that Dostoevsky builds his story. Mishkin is born into this in-between space, a man who symbolizes Christian kindness in a world that no longer has patience for it. He represents an ideal that, in the eyes of Russian society at the time, already seemed outdated. And that is one of the reasons he is treated as an aberration. He does not belong to the new world that was emerging, nor does he fit into the old one. His presence only reinforces the discomfort of an era that did not know where it was headed. At its core, his story reflects the dilemma of the Russian people themselves, torn between clinging to the past or embracing an uncertain future. This existential crisis was not limited to 19th century Russia. Throughout history, entire societies have faced transitional periods where old values clashed with new ideologies. The Industrial Revolution, the fall of empires, the rise of capitalism. Whenever profound change occurs, those who do not fit suffer. Dostoevsky transformed this sense of displacement into flesh and blood, into the figure of Mishkin, and perhaps that's why his novel still resonates so strongly today. We live in equally turbulent times, where old values are questioned and new ways of thinking emerge constantly. And just like in the past, those who fail to adapt quickly enough are left behind. This brings us to another fascinating point in Dostoevsky's work: his ability to enter the human mind and reveal not only social dilemmas, but also the inner conflicts of his characters. If The Idiot works as a study of society, it is also a deep dive into the human psyche. And this is where one of Dostoevsky's greatest strengths as a writer comes into play: his psychological realism. Long before Freud, Dostoevsky was already exploring the depths of the human mind. His characters are not just archetypes, but individuals with layers of conflict, hidden desires, and contradictory impulses. In The Idiot, he shows us that human beings are not guided solely by reason, but also by internal forces they do not always understand. Mishkin, for example, does not act like a conventional hero because his goodness does not come from logic. It is a genuine impulse that compels him to be this way, even when it harms him. This deep psychological insight is what makes his novels so timeless. He did not just describe actions, he plunged into the minds of his characters, revealing their fears, doubts, and contradictions. That is why his work anticipated many ideas that would later be explored in psychoanalysis. Freud recognized this, Jung even more so. He saw in Dostoevsky a unique ability to translate the deepest processes of the human psyche into literature. But there is something even more fascinating. Dostoevsky does not merely describe the human mind, he makes it interact with the society around it. Mishkin is not just a good man, he is a good man in a world that does not know how to handle him. His reactions, choices, and even his fragility only make sense within this larger context. He is living proof that psychology cannot be separated from the culture in which it exists. This still applies today. Understanding the human mind without considering the social environment is a mistake. What shapes us is not just our biology or individual experiences, but also the era we live in, the rules we follow, the values we absorb. Dostoevsky understood this long before modern psychology. That is why reading his novels remains so revealing. But if Mishkin carries within him such psychological complexity, an inevitable question arises. What is the fate of a man like him? What happens when someone so pure is placed in a world that does not accept him? Mishkin's tragedy is not the result of his own failures, but of the world's inability to accept him. He is not rejected for being cruel, dishonest, or greedy. On the contrary, it is his absolute goodness that condemns him. In an environment where cunning and manipulation are necessary for survival, someone who refuses to play the game is destined to be cast aside. And worse, his existence does not just disturb people, it disarms the cynics. No one wants to be reminded of what they gave up in order to adapt. Mishkin has no declared enemies, but he also has no true allies. He does not inspire loyalty because his goodness does not come with promises of advantage, making him disposable. People approach him out of curiosity, out of fascination, but never out of genuine understanding. He belongs to no group, fits in nowhere. His tragedy is not just loneliness, it is the realization that purity is seen as a burden, not a virtue. This pattern is not exclusive to fiction. In any environment, from social circles to the corporate world, those who act with absolute honesty are often seen as naive, if not as obstacles. The world does not reward emotional transparency. It punishes it. Many recognize this early on and adjust accordingly, but those who insist on staying true to their essence end up isolated. And perhaps this is Dostoevsky's greatest provocation. Is it possible to be pure without being crushed by the system? If purity is so unsettling, it is because it carries a weight that few are willing to bear. Being truthful requires a strength that most people lack. And in the end, the world finds ways to eliminate those who insist on being this way. In Mishkin's case, his downfall is not due to failure, but because his mere presence serves as an uncomfortable reminder that perhaps the world is wrong. And this leads us to an even deeper question. Was Mishkin's destruction inevitable? Or, in any era, will a pure man always be crushed by a world that values cunning? His downfall is not an accident, but a logical consequence. A man who refuses to manipulate or lie cannot thrive in a world where these skills are essential. Those who play fair are always at a disadvantage against those who have no scruples. And Dostoevsky forces us to confront this reality without romanticism. Being good is not enough to win. In fact, in many cases, it is precisely what leads to defeat. But why does the world punish purity? Because it makes people uncomfortable. When someone acts with absolute sincerity, they unintentionally expose the masks of those around them. And no one likes being unmasked. Emotional transparency challenges the power structures built on manipulation. And what happens to those who refuse to conform? They are ridiculed, excluded, discarded. This logic has not changed. In any society, vulnerability is exploited, not respected. In the workplace, sincerity is often seen as a lack of strategy. In relationships, transparency is mistaken for weakness. And in politics, those who speak the truth without filters rarely make it far. The system favors those who know how to play the game, not those who refuse to participate. And this is the great irony. Those who maintain their integrity are seen as naive, while those who adapt and manipulate are called intelligent. What does that say about society's values? If survival depends on masking emotions and hiding intentions, then what is the cost of being authentic? If Mishkin's fate seems inevitable, perhaps the real question is not about him, but about us. After all, if society always rejects those who refuse to play the game, what does that say about the world we have built? Mishkin's tragedy remains relevant because the same mechanisms that destroyed him still operate today. Society continues to reward cunning over honesty, manipulation over transparency. How many times has someone felt the need to hide their true essence just to be accepted? How often has authenticity been seen as a mistake? The Idiot is not just a novel about 19th century Russia, it is a chilling mirror of the modern world. Today, we live in an era where image matters more than truth. Social media has turned life into a grand spectacle where no one can afford to be completely sincere. The rules of the game are clear. Showing vulnerability is a risk. Being too transparent is a mistake. Those who, like Mishkin, express their emotions without filters quickly become targets of criticism, disdain, or even cancellation. As always, Dostoevsky had already foreseen this dynamic, and the most disturbing part is that, even knowing this, most people continue playing along. Why? Because those who refuse to participate are left behind. The world has not changed that much. It is still a place where cleverness triumphs over honesty, where those who lie best often win. The only difference is that now the rules are more subtle, more sophisticated, but just as ruthless. This leads us to a dilemma. If the world has always favored those who know how to manipulate, does that mean there is no room for those who choose to act with integrity? Or are there other ways to survive without giving in to cynicism? Dostoevsky shows us the problem, but the solution, if there is one, is ours to find. And here arises a new paradox. Did Mishkin truly fail, or was it the world that failed him? Perhaps the real problem is not in the protagonist himself, but in the structure that condemned him. The great paradox of Mishkin is that despite constantly being called an idiot, he is, in reality, the most lucid of them all. He sees reality without the distortions of ego, without the need to manipulate or deceive. But this clarity is precisely what makes him unbearable to others. In a world where everyone wears masks, those who refuse to do so become a problem. Mishkin is not unsettling because he is naive. He is unsettling because he is true. And this leads us to an uncomfortable question. Is corruption truly inevitable? Society teaches us that there is no choice but to adapt. But what if there is? What if true strength is not in knowing how to manipulate, but in remaining whole despite the circumstances? Dostoevsky does not give us easy answers, but he forces us to confront this question. The most curious thing is that Mishkin is not naive in the traditional sense. He perceives the social game, he understands the rules, he simply chooses not to follow them. However, that choice comes at a high price. Absolute goodness is not seen as a virtue, but as a weakness. People do not tolerate those who act without ulterior motives because it forces them to question their own. And so, Mishkin's true dilemma is not his lack of cleverness, but his refusal to accept that cynicism is the only option. This is a conflict that remains just as relevant today. Is the only way to survive to accept the rules of the game? Or is there an alternative path? Dostoevsky provokes us, makes us question, but never hands us a ready-made answer. And perhaps that is why Mishkin's journey so closely resembles that of messianic figures. In the end, his absolute goodness is not just a trait of his personality, it is a challenge to the very structure of the world. Dostoevsky constructs Mishkin as more than just a pure man. He is an archetype, a messianic figure who walks among the corrupt without ever being tainted. Like Christ, he does not retaliate when attacked, does not hate when betrayed, and does not judge when ridiculed. He offers unconditional kindness, not because he expects anything in return, but because he knows no other way to be. And it is precisely this absolute goodness that condemns him. In the real world, martyrs are not applauded, they are crucified. But there is one crucial difference. While Christ was aware of his mission and accepted his fate, Mishkin is merely a man trying to exist. He does not seek to convert anyone, nor does he desire to save souls. He simply lives according to his own essence, without realizing that this alone is a challenge to society. And since every society rejects what it does not understand, he becomes a target. His suffering is not the consequence of his own sins, but of the sins of others. The greatest irony is that many of those who turn against Mishkin are not bad people. They are merely individuals who, at some point, had to adapt in order to survive. And that makes his presence even more unbearable, because he reminds them of what they could have been if they had not surrendered to the game. And no one likes to be reminded of their compromises. And here lies the great question. Could a man like Mishkin exist without being destroyed? Or is anyone who refuses to play the game doomed to be crushed? Dostoevsky does not give us an answer, but he forces us to look at our own reality. How many times have we witnessed kindness being exploited? How often have we seen integrity being punished? If Mishkin is a symbol of Christ, his journey serves as a grim warning. Perhaps the world will never be ready for those who dare to be truly pure. And this leads us to the final great reflection on the idiot. What is the true lesson of this story? What does the idiot really teach us? That absolute goodness is impossible, that corruption is inevitable, or that the world rejects those who refuse to play along? Dostoevsky delivers a novel that not only provokes, but unsettles. He forces us to confront the fact that, as much as we admire purity, we rarely choose it. Deep down, we know that if we were placed in Mishkin's world, most of us would try to fix him, ridicule him, or at the very least, distance ourselves from him. And this is the cruelest point of the novel. It forces us to admit that if we were inside the story, we might be among those who contributed to his downfall, not out of malice, but because we have been taught from an early age that there is no place for people like him. That goodness must have limits, that naivety must be corrected, that purity must be dismantled. And if this is the lesson we carry, then what does that say about us? What makes The Idiot so timeless is not just its analysis of 19th century Russian society, but its precise diagnosis of human nature. Mishkin's rejection is not an exception, it is the rule. The world has always favored those who know how to manipulate and has marginalized those who refuse to do so. And if this is still happening, is it just a problem of the past? Or are we still living in a world that cannot tolerate those who choose to be authentic? And here we arrive at the great irony of the novel. Despite its title, The Idiot shows us that perhaps the real fool is not Mishkin, but those who accept the rules of the game without questioning them. Because in the end, what is worse? Being rejected for being pure, or being accepted for having been corrupted? The question that remains is not about Mishkin, it is about us. He was destroyed for his purity, but what about those who condemned him? Were they truly more intelligent, or simply more complicit in the hypocrisy of the world? If society always discards those who refuse to play the game, does that mean the real idiot is the one who holds on to their integrity, or the one who accepts corruption in order to survive? Dostoevsky does not provide answers. He only forces us to confront the discomfort. How many times have we justified our moral compromises by saying, "That's just how life is"? How often have we dismissed transparency while rewarding cunning? Perhaps the real question is not who the idiot is, but how many times we have been one. If you enjoyed this content, subscribe to the channel and stay with me for the next video.